So Donald Trump actually went ahead and initiated a special military operation against the leadership of Venezuela. Caracas was taken in half an hour, the president of the country has been kidnapped, and he is already sitting in New York awaiting trial. Turns out things like this actually happen. Let's discuss what went down and speakers are predicting. But in the meantime, write in the comments. Do you think this was the right move by the Trump? So, deep in the night of January 3rd, 2026, the sky over Caracas erupted in explosions. Several days prior, Donald Trump had issued the order to commence a military operation against Venezuela. By the way, here is a fun fact for you. There is a Twitter account called Pentagon Pizza that tracks the workload of the pizza place next to the Pentagon. As a rule, when some major action is about to start, the pizzeria's workload spikes sharply. The military doesn't go home until late, and they order pizza. Well, this account recorded a surge in activity a couple of hours before the operation began. The same thing happened in the summer before the strike on Iran. According to General Dan Kane, U.S. intelligence began preparing the operation against Venezuela about a month ago. Intelligence determined exactly where and how Nicolás Maduro lived and studied his habits. Satellites were used for surveillance, as well as agents within Venezuela, including those inside the president's inner circle. Based on this data, an exact replica of Maduro's residence was constructed, where the military trained on how to take it. At the moment the operation commenced, over 150 combat and reconnaissance aircraft took to the skies, including F-35 fighters and B-1 strategic bombers. Immediately following them, Chinook helicopters and the MH-6 Little Birds of the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, launched with an assault team of Army Special Forces, Delta Force. If the old school crowd is here and remembers the old 2003 game Delta Force, hit the like button. The helicopters flew over the sea at an altitude of about 30 meters. As they approached the Venezuelan capital, aviation began striking air defense targets in the port of La Guaira and at the Higuerote and La Carlota airports. One of the helicopters sustained damage and returned to the aircraft carrier. Delta Force operators breached President Maduro's residence and seized him, along with his wife, right in their bedroom. While exiting the building, the Special Forces engaged in a firefight. Several personnel were wounded, but successfully boarded the helicopter and extracted. During this time, Trump, Marco Rubio, and Pete Hegseth were watching the operation live from a special situation room in Trump's Mar-a-Lago residence in Florida. The helicopters landed on the deck of the ship USS Iwo Jima, and Maduro, in handcuffs and blackout goggles, was sent to the American base at Guantanamo in Cuba. From there, he and his wife were flown to New York, where they will be held in a maximum security prison, the same one where, for example, P. Diddy was held. Footage has already emerged of him arriving at this detention center. In the end, the entire operation took half an hour. Maduro and his inner circle have been officially charged with trafficking and weapons possession. There were no irrevocable losses among the American military. The New York Times reports and wounded among the civilian population. Ultimately, Trump gave a press conference where he announced that this was one of the most effective operations by the American military, unparalleled since World War II, and that no other country could have executed such a thing. Overwhelming American military power, air, land, and sea forces was deployed to conduct a breathtaking assault. An assault of a scale people haven't seen since the Second World War. In general, it was all in Trump's style. He stated that the U.S. will now manage Venezuela until a safe and reasonable transition of power can be achieved. He named a key element of this plan: attracting the largest American oil companies to invest billions of dollars into restoring the destroyed oil infrastructure, promising to make the Venezuelan people very rich, independent, and safe. This partnership between Venezuela and the United States of America, a country everyone wants to do business with because of what we can achieve and what we can accomplish, will make the people of Venezuela rich, independent, and safe. That is speaking to the facts of what happened. What is there to say? Apparently, this is what a real, special military operation looks like. More than a day later, it is already clear that the answer is no. So, how are people reacting inside America and beyond its borders? Inside the US, Republicans are applauding. while Democrats are condemning. Many Congress members expressed concern regarding the constitutionality of the president's actions, as war was not declared and congressional approval was not obtained. What does the law actually require? Democratic Senator and Iraq War veteran Ruben Gallego stated, quote, "This war is illegal," calling it the second unjustified war in his lifetime after the war in Iraq. The House Armed Services Committee has begun organizing a special briefing on the situation, indicating Congress's intent to take the investigation under its control. Even some allies of the Trump administration expressed bewilderment in private conversations that Congress wasn't even informed in advance. Among those condemning the act is former U.S. Ambassador to Russia Michael McFaul, whom Twitter users have already reminded of his condemnation of all Russians at the start of the 2022 war. A rally condemning U.S. actions was held near the White House and in New York's Times Square. Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson called the operation an illegal act that increases the likelihood of full-scale war, adding that its true goals were oil and power. Even harsher was the new mayor of New York, Zohran Mamdani, who called the event an act of war and a violation of both federal and international law, emphasizing that such a unilateral attack on a sovereign state affects tens of thousands of Venezuelans living in the city. By the way, he himself took the oath of office as mayor just a couple of days ago, swearing on the Quran, a first in the city's history. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs expressed deep concern and condemnation regarding the act of armed aggression by the U.S. The internet remembered that quite recently, Russia delivered S-300 systems to Venezuela, and Russian media headlines claimed the Americans were in for a warm welcome. Apparently, something went wrong. It is also reported that Russia allegedly gave Venezuela loans amounting to several $billion over the last 10 years. What happens to those loans now is also a question. Alexander Lukashenko categorically condemned the act of aggression against Venezuela and reminded everyone that he predicted a second Vietnam for the Americans if they attacked. The Ukrainian Foreign Ministry stated that Maduro was not a legitimate president and effectively supported the U.S. actions. EU High Representative Kaja Kallas called for restraint and adherence to international law and the UN Charter. Colombian President Gustavo Petro called for de-escalation and peace in the region. Argentine President Javier Milei supported the U.S., writing, "Long live freedom, damn it." In summary, the U.S. actions were factually condemned only by Russia, China, Cuba, and Brazil. The rest either supported it or simply called for de-escalation. The Venezuelan diaspora in the U.S. and inside Venezuela reacted with jubilation regarding Maduro's overthrow. And traditionally, this event was not ignored by memes. I think you've already seen plenty of them. Friends, don't forget to hit the like button. This is the best support you can give the channel. If you want to support the work of me and my team in other ways, you can use the Super Thanks function on YouTube. But what is the deal with this Venezuela anyway? Why did Trump, starting in the autumn of 2025, suddenly start shooting at Venezuelan boats and amassing the U.S. Navy fleet in the Caribbean? Let me give you a short educational crash course. What was happening with this country and why did Trump latch onto it? In the early 19th century, as a result of war, the country gained independence from the Spanish Empire under the leadership of Simon Bolivar. For a time, Venezuela was part of the Federal Republic of Gran Colombia, along with Colombia and Ecuador, but then exited it to become a separate republic. For almost the entire 19th century, the country went through civil wars, military coups, and the rule of military juntas replacing one another. In the early 20th century, massive oil deposits were found in the country, as it turned out later, the largest in the world. This happened under the dictator Gomez, who began attracting foreign capital to the oil sector. The country didn't have its own money or technology to develop the fields, so who came to Venezuela? American companies, for example, Shell and Standard Oil. They built infrastructure, cities, and ports around the deposits and export terminals. The country's economy began to orient itself toward the export of crude oil. As a result, the Gomez dictatorship received a huge influx of money, which maintained the army and the apparatus of repression. Because of this, the social contract was deformed. The state no longer relied on citizens' taxes and consequently felt no demand for accountability to citizens, institutions, or social programs. A whole class of elites emerged, closely tied to foreign corporations and the military. Meanwhile, the common people lived very poorly and received almost no benefit from the oil money. Eventually, by the 1960s, the country arrived at democracy. The leaders of the three largest political parties signed an agreement on power sharing and mutual recognition of election results to prevent the return of military dictatorships and to stabilize the state. In the 60s and 70s, oil money financed infrastructure projects, the expansion of the state apparatus, and social programs. Venezuela began to be described as the only democratic exception against the backdrop of authoritarian Latin America. But gradually, the ruling parties began to control all state resources. Appointments, budgets, corruption increased, poverty grew, and the participation of ordinary people in politics declined. In 1978, the so-called reversion law was passed, under which all oil fields managed by foreign companies had to pass under state control by 1983. Effectively, nationalization. The State Oil Corporation PDVSA was created, becoming one of the largest oil companies in the world. However, under state management, dependence on oil only intensified. In the 80s, oil prices slumped, leading to a contraction of Venezuela's GDP, rising inflation, and national debt. In 1989, President Carlos Perez launched a harsh reform program, which led to rising prices for gasoline and transport, cuts in subsidies for social programs, and exploded into mass protests and pogroms, during which thousands of civilians died at the hands of the army and police. Against this background, the charismatic Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chavez appears, attempting a failed coup in 1992, but becoming a symbol of anti-system protest. Eventually, he receives a pardon from the state and builds the Fifth Republic political movement. In the 1998 elections, he wins, promising the poor population large-scale social programs. A year later, he adopts a new constitution, strengthens presidential powers, creates a unicameral parliament, and begins the gradual concentration of power, influencing, for example, the Supreme Court and the security forces. Chavez strengthens control over the State Oil Corporation and effectively turns it into a wallet for socialist programs. He also raises taxes on foreigners. Chavez launches dozens of programs for the population, eliminating illiteracy, free medical care in poor neighborhoods, cheap grocery chains, housing programs, vocational training, and many others. In the 2000s, poverty and inequality in the country did indeed decrease as a result of these programs. But the problem was that all this was done with the oil money of a state corporation that was managed inefficiently. But they got away with it because oil prices were at record highs. The Chavez government also introduced strict currency controls and fixed exchange rates, which led to the flourishing of a black market for currency and corruption. Television, electricity, cement, and banks were nationalized. In general, the state's share of the economy grew. In foreign policy, Chavez adhered to anti-American rhetoric, concluding an alliance with Cuba and leftist regimes in the region. In 2013, Chavez died of cancer, and Nicolás Maduro, the vice president under Chavez, won the election. Oil prices began to fall. Production in the country dropped sharply due to lack of funding, technical wear and tear of equipment, and corruption. Instead of lifting currency controls, Maduro only tightened them and financed the budget deficit by printing new money. All this led to hyperinflation. GDP began to fall at double-digit rates for several years in a row, and between 2014 and 2020, Venezuela's economy contracted by 80%, while inflation in 2018 reached tens of thousands of percent per year. Maduro carried out denominations several times, removing zeros from bills, but did not change the basic policy. Venezuela began to experience shortages of basic products. In 2015, the opposition won a majority in parliament, but the Supreme Court, controlled by the authorities, blocked its decisions and effectively stripped it of any power. In 2017, Maduro did something genius. He created a parallel parliament, the Constituent Assembly, to bypass the opposition parliament. Very convenient. The presidential elections of 2018 and 2024 were accompanied by accusations of falsification and non-recognition by the international community. The authorities at this time conducted harsh crackdowns on protests, and reports of torture and extrajudicial executions appeared. Independent media in the country was completely shut down, and arrests were made of people publishing the black market currency rate and even publishing independent inflation data. In the early 20s, Maduro effectively allowed the use of the dollar inside Venezuela, which temporarily lowered inflation and led to a feeling of recovery. For example, shops and restaurants reopened in Caracas. But this effect was noticeable only in the capital. The periphery continued to remain poor, and infrastructure remained destroyed. Donald Trump, in his first term, strengthened sanctions against the Maduro government, especially regarding the oil sector and access to financing. Sanctions exacerbated the drop in production and the currency deficit. But most analysts agree that the roots of the Venezuelan crisis lie in years of oil paternalism, state control, and the macroeconomic policies of the Hugo Chavez era. In 2025, Donald Trump begins accusing Venezuela of trafficking and calls Maduro the head of a cartel. He accuses him of almost personally sending members of dangerous criminal gangs to the U.S. to commit all sorts of crimes here. Calls begin to sound for the return of American money invested by oil companies in the development of oil infrastructure, which was then nationalized by the country's authorities. Since Maduro came to power, more than 8 million Venezuelans have left the country. By 2026, the country remains in a state of severe crisis, high inflation, weak currency, exorbitant crime rates, poverty, mass migration, and, as before, high budget dependence on ever-falling oil revenues. And this is despite the fact that the country has the largest oil reserves in the world. Only time will tell what happens after Maduro's arrest and whether the country's situation will improve with Trump's arrival. Why did Trump take such a step? For oil, historical ambitions, or some other reason? Many analysts, international relations experts, the U.S. foreign policy doctrine that the entire Western Hemisphere, meaning both Americas, is a zone of U.S. state interests. And largely, this new U.S. foreign policy strategy resonates a bit with this Monroe Doctrine. Others see Trump's actions as a multi-move game against Iran, where things are also currently turbulent and the whole country is burning in protests. How do they explain this? If the U.S. manages to establish control over Venezuela and the world's largest oil reserves, they will dominate energy, logistics, and regional politics. Control over Venezuelan oil will reduce U.S. vulnerability to disruptions in the Middle East and allow them to more easily weather potential strikes on infrastructure in the Persian Gulf in the event of, say, some military clash with Iran. This will reduce the price of escalation and make pressure on Iran more manageable. Simultaneously, the U.S. will strengthen its influence on global oil flows and prices, supporting the key role of the dollar and the petrodollar system. But if the U.S. gets bogged down in Venezuela and faces protracted resistance, everything will be exactly the opposite. Political and economic resources will be depleted, and the ability to project power will shrink, including toward Iran. On the other hand, more pessimistic forecasts are sounding that by striking Venezuela, the U.S. has effectively started the war for Taiwan or even World War III, because in recent years, most of the oil from Venezuela went specifically to China, which has now allegedly been put to an end, and China supposedly cannot leave this unanswered. Others call what happened a true structural rupture and a transition to new rules of the game. That the monster of the U.S. has crossed a threshold that rewrites the unwritten rules of the entire global system. A sitting U.S. president effectively kidnapped the head of a foreign state. The operation was conducted without UN approval, under conditions of undeclared war, with an open admission of the goal of regime change. Now markets, governments, and America's adversaries have to reassess not only the risk associated with Venezuela, but also the degree of U.S. unpredictability, their military capabilities, and, most importantly, political readiness for forceful actions. Firstly, a recalibration of the global deterrent system has occurred. This was not a long proxy war, like the ones Iran wages, but effectively a surgical incision to behead a regime. A signal allegedly addressed to Iran, North Korea, even Russia and the BRICS countries building alternative financial channels. Secondly, a signal of U.S. dominance has been sent. Washington demonstrated that, if necessary, they act as the global policeman. Institutions are bypassed, international law becomes optional, and control over the narrative is returned through direct aggressive actions. Now, every government in Latin America needs to reevaluate its security guarantees. Vulnerability to dollar-based retaliatory measures and internal political risks if power suddenly begins to lean toward authoritarianism. As a result, there is less global stability in the world. The U.S. has reactivated its harsh, forceful toolkit, which had been dormant for many years. The country is once again demonstrating the capacity for regime change. Write in the comments what you personally think about the consequences for the world. Of course, against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine, which has been going on for almost 4 years, American actions contrast very sharply. As they say, everyone wants a small, victorious war, but not everyone succeeds. But it looks like Trump succeeded. What a strange world we live in. That's all, friends. Don't forget to smash those fat likes, subscribe, and we will see you in new videos. Until next time, bye-bye.